As anyone who's been paying attention can see, cryptocurrencies have been taking a big hit lately, dropping in prices and losing billions of dollars in value. But what's really interesting is as that's happening, companies from all over the world are starting to take a renewed interest in the underlying blockchain technology. These big enterprises are looking for other ways that they can move value from one point to another using a blockchain without unnecessary middlemen. If you look back over the history of blockchain adoption, the first use case was Bitcoin, the cryptocurrency. And its big selling point was that anybody could use it, and you could move value from point A to point B without any middlemen. The downside to that, though, is that the transactions were all out there for anybody to see. It only took a little bit of work for people to start to triangulate who these identities were and to learn about how these transactions were being used. Now, for a big enterprise, this just can't happen. Not only to protect the privacies of their customers, but for regulatory reasons. There's actually controls in place to ensure that these big enterprises aren't letting our information just go out into the world willy-nilly. So they're reaching out to third-party software providers who are creating these permissioned blockchains and building whole new ways of doing business that let them move everything from money to records of tuna transactions using a shared distributed ledger without the unnecessary middlemen. The biggest difference between these permissioned blockchains that enterprises are increasingly becoming comfortable with and the permissionless blockchains is where the source of trust comes from. In a permissionless blockchain like Bitcoin and Ethereum, the trust comes from two pretty simple factors: mathematics and electricity. But the downside to that is because you're trusting these outside sources, mathematics and electricity, the transactions tend to be a little more easy to view. Now, for enterprises, the group of people that need access to these blockchains is a lot smaller. This is what's called a trusted setup, or an invitation-only setup, which is why the blockchains themselves are frequently called permissioned. Now, what's really interesting, though, is that these two worlds, the permissioned world and the permissionless world, aren't diametrically opposed. They're actually on a spectrum, and you can have different degrees of permission and privacy depending on who you are and what you build. So what's happening now that these big enterprises are getting increasingly comfortable with using permissioned blockchains is they're starting to learn new ways where they can use public blockchains and the increased efficiency that comes from that, but in a way that still protects their users' privacy and hopefully complies with regulatory concerns. So because permissionless blockchains like Bitcoin were inherently financial in the beginning, most of the use cases out there are indeed financial. But what's really interesting as a broader sector of enterprises get involved is we're seeing all kinds of different ways that blockchain can be used. In fact, in the end, what blockchain really is just a way to prove that you've moved something from one place to another. And so we've seen companies like Bumblebee Tuna that has a long history of difficulty proving the origin of its tuna use blockchain to give consumers increased certainty that what they're eating is in fact what they believe they're eating. More importantly, that it was captured in a way that they find ethical. What Bumblebee has found is that to get the tuna from one place to another requires a lot of levels of the supply chain. And in order to give their end consumer that increased certainty that their fish hasn't accidentally captured something that was unintended or that it was done in an immoral way, they've got together all the data about how it was captured and given it to their customers. The problem with that solution is that it still relies on trusting Bumblebee. And Bumblebee isn't a data company. So what they did is they used a blockchain to give every level of the supply chain, from the fishermen to the packagers to the canners to the shippers to the grocery stores, access to the same distributed ledger. So you don't have to trust Bumblebee anymore. You can actually see into the core of the underlying supply chain, and if there is any fraud, if there is any concern, we know exactly where it came from, and instead of the feeling of being powerless, we can know exactly how to fix it. Another really interesting enterprise use case of blockchain is Golden State Foods. They provide food for some of the biggest fast food chains in the world, including McDonald's. So what Golden State Foods has done is they've actually moved the entire beef supply chain that goes into their hamburger process to a shared distributed ledger. They're taking what's essentially boring accounting software and adding on all kinds of fun bells and whistles. For example, the boxes that hold the hamburgers have thermometers in them and RFID chips, and the data is logged on the blockchain so that you can literally see as an object moves from one place to another. As one person takes custody over the burgers, you can be assured that the temperature of those hamburgers hasn't gone too high or hasn't gone too low if you're trying to prove that the food was never frozen. What's really important about this is for companies that want to be able to charge more for premium services, like for example, that their meat was never frozen, can now prove beyond the shadow of a doubt that in fact the meat was never frozen. In other words, by using a blockchain, by moving that supply chain to a shared distributed ledger, we no longer have to trust Golden State Foods or McDonald's that hamburger meat has never been frozen. We can trust the blockchain. One of the most valuable aspects of these enterprises adopting blockchain technology is they've given us a new way to talk about this technology. Cryptocurrency was inherently and is inherently difficult to communicate the value of. Enterprise adoption of blockchain is letting us track things that we can hold in our hands and in some cases even put in our mouths. Once we have that real world connection to how these products impact us, and we start to go backwards to see how removing unnecessary middlemen can both speed up the rate that we're able to take care of business and let us do it cheaper, the benefits of blockchain become much more easy to understand. As enterprises get increasingly comfortable with using these permission blockchains, I'd be keeping your eyes open for them to start exploring other ways to use permissionless blockchains like Bitcoin and Ethereum to do the same thing, but with new imaginative ways to protect their customers' identities.